The woman whose scars commanded silence. The woman who walked into the barracks. It was late autumn when she first appeared at the barracks. I remember because the leaves outside had already turned brittle, carried by winds that cut across the base like knives. The evenings grew darker faster, and the mornings carried with them the smell of frost, that peculiar scent of cold iron and damp earth that only a soldier could love, or at least get used to. We had settled into our routines then, the endless drills, the mess hall gossip, the hollow laughter that men use to cover emptiness. War wasn't raging on our doorstep that week, but it lived in our bones. For men like us, the war never truly ended. It just shifted, sometimes outside, sometimes inside. And then she walked in. Not loudly, not with any authority that could be read from stripes on a sleeve or stars on a shoulder. She walked in as if she had every right to exist there, though no one had ever told us her name or why she was assigned to the barracks. What drew every eye to her was not her uniform, because she wore none. It wasn't her hair, cropped short, nor her boots, which seemed second-hand. It was something else, something unspoken. The scars. They crept across her skin like shadows that refused to die. Lines across her forearms, faded burns along her neck, and a mark across her cheek. Not deep enough to distort her face, but enough to command attention. And in that moment, the barracks split in two, those who looked at her scars and felt shame, and those who looked at them and felt power. The latter laughed. I heard it begin as a snicker, the kind that escapes without permission. Then it spread like fire through dry grass. Men elbowed one another, whispering things that seemed brave only when spoken in packs. Some muttered cruel jokes under their breath, loud enough for her to hear, soft enough for them to pretend it wasn't meant for her. But she kept walking, step by step, slow and deliberate. Her eyes didn't rise to meet theirs. She did not flinch when the laughter echoed louder. She did not quicken her pace. She simply walked, carrying with her the silence of someone who had already seen worse. I thought then, what battlefield shaped her? Because scars like those are not given. They are earned in places where screams are swallowed by night. They come from fires no one puts out, from blows no one stops, from choices made in rooms where the world has already abandoned you. And yet, she stood. I would like to tell you that I spoke up that night, that I silenced the mockery with words or fists, but I did not. I was a coward in my own way, not for lack of courage in battle, but for fear of facing a truth that lived in her skin. To speak for her would have meant admitting that those scars told a story I, too, recognized. A story of how the war had no rules, no mercy, no justice, not for men, and certainly not for women. Instead, I stayed quiet. I watched. The barracks was a cruel place for silence, yet she mastered it. Where most of us filled the air with noise, she filled it with absence. She didn't explain, didn't justify, didn't beg. And in her silence, there was something stronger than all our words combined. The men didn't see it then. They only saw weakness. But I knew better. I had seen men crumble from a single wound, their spirits shattered long before their flesh. She carried dozens, visible and invisible, and yet she walked as if every step was a victory against the world that had tried to erase her. That night, when the lights dimmed and the barracks quieted, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about her scars. They weren't just marks, they were maps. Each one pointed somewhere, to a night of terror, to a battlefield no history book would mention, to a violence most men would deny. And I realized something I still carry with me. Scars are not the end of a story. They are the beginning of silence, the kind that forces others to listen, even when they don't want to. She walked into the barracks that autumn evening, not as a soldier, not as a victim, but as a reminder. A reminder that war does not end when guns fall silent. That the deepest battles are carried on skin, in bones, in memories. And though they mocked her then, one day, her scars would command silence. The woman laughed at by Marines. The second day she spent among us was worse than the first. The barracks had a way of testing newcomers, like wolves circling to see if the wounded would stumble. For men, it was about proving strength in fights or boasting about women they had known. For her, it was different. She was tested with silence first, then with laughter. The Marines had made it into a game. I remember them at the mess hall table, their voices rising above the clatter of tin trays and spoons scraping against plates. One whispered something, and another burst out laughing so hard his soup spilled. They didn't even bother hiding their cruelty anymore. "She looks like she wrestled with fire and lost," one said. "Or maybe she won," another replied, smirking. "And that's why the fire looks worse than her." The table erupted. She sat 2 rows away, eating slowly, eyes fixed on her bread as though nothing else existed. The laughter cut the air, sharp and deliberate. She didn't raise her head. She didn't bite back. She chewed as if every movement of her jaw was an act of defiance. "I will not give you what you want," and yet even in her silence, the room shifted. Some laughed louder, emboldened by her refusal to react. Others laughed less, unease beginning to creep in, and a few, like me, said nothing, but felt the shame burn like acid in the stomach. I had fought battles with men who later cried in the mud, shaking like children when the mortars fell. I had held friends as they bled, whispering lies like "you'll be fine," when both of us knew the truth. But never had I seen a soldier, no, a human being, carry such calm in the face of mockery. Her silence was not weakness, it was control, and the men didn't even see it. That night, one Marine tried to push further. He walked up to her bunk, sneering, his voice thick with bravado. "So tell us," he said, "how'd you get those? Enemy bayonet, or did your husband just get tired of you?" The laughter that followed was cruel, raw. It filled the room like smoke, choking everyone in it. But she didn't flinch. She didn't look up. She just sat, stitching a torn sleeve, her fingers steady. The needle pierced fabric, thread pulled tight, as though mending cloth was more important than mending pride. Something in that moment struck me deeper than any battlefield ever had. She wasn't ignoring them. She was showing them what they were: noise, temporary, shallow, hollow noise. And her silence, her calm, deliberate stitching, made their words sound like the pathetic echoes they were. The Marine, waiting for her reaction, finally faltered. His grin faded when she refused to give him the victory of pain. He muttered a curse and walked away. But the barracks had already seen enough. For the first time, some began to wonder, what kind of woman doesn't break under laughter? I couldn't sleep that night. I lay awake listening to the steady rhythm of her stitching, the whisper of needle and thread moving in the dark. It sounded like a heartbeat, calm and unyielding. And in that sound, I realized something. The Marines thought they were mocking her scars, but really, they were revealing their own. Their laughter was their scar, ugly, loud, impossible to hide. It told the truth about them, that they feared her strength because it reflected their weakness. As dawn broke, I saw her standing alone by the window, watching the pale light creep across the frost-bitten yard. Her profile was calm, but the scars across her cheek caught the sunlight like lines of fire. She did not hide them. She did not cover them. She let the world see. And for the first time, I understood. Her scars were not wounds. They were armor. The woman whose scars whispered. By the third day, her presence was no longer a surprise. The men had grown used to seeing her at meals, in the corridors, even standing silently in the yard as drills unfolded. Yet the novelty of her scars had not faded. If anything, it deepened. The laughter still came, but less like thunder and more like whispers in corners. Cruel jokes shrank into murmurs, traded in hushed tones, as though mocking her out loud was now dangerous. The silence she carried had begun to spread, and in that silence I noticed something none of the others did. Her scars spoke, not in the way flesh speaks when it is fresh and red, but in the way old wounds become symbols when they refuse to disappear. Each mark on her skin seemed to hold a story too heavy for words. A line across her forearm bent strangely, as though it had been carved not by accident, but by intention. A burn on her neck had the faint curve of rope, like fire meeting restraint. And the scar on her cheek, thin, deliberate, unforgiving, looked as though it had been placed there by someone who wanted the world to see it forever. The Marines mocked her because they couldn't understand. They saw only disfigurement, but I saw memory carved into flesh. The kind of memory that refuses to be buried. One evening, as she sat alone near the back of the mess hall, I dared to take a seat across from her. The men nearby stared, curious, waiting to see if I would break the unspoken rule of silence that surrounded her. She did not look up, only kept eating slowly, methodically. I found myself speaking without knowing why. "Those scars," I said quietly, "they tell a story." For the first time since she arrived, she lifted her gaze to mine. Her eyes were not sharp, not angry, not even surprised. They were patient, as though she had been waiting for someone to say those words. She did not answer. She simply tilted her head slightly, and the dim light above us caught her scars in sharp relief. And in that silence, I heard them whisper. They whispered of nights with no rescue, of rooms where doors were locked from the outside, of hands that did not know mercy, of flames that took more than skin. They took innocence, dignity, time. They whispered of survival not as triumph, but as punishment. They whispered that she had seen what no soldier could ever name without shame. I froze, spoon clutched in my hand, unable to move. I realized that her silence wasn't emptiness, it was protection, because if she spoke, if she truly told the story those scars whispered, none of us would sleep again. She lowered her gaze and returned to her meal. I had my answer. The next day, the men tried again. One Marine, drunk on cheap liquor smuggled in, staggered to her cot and demanded, "Tell us what happened. Tell us where you got those marks. Bet it was from begging for mercy." His words dripped poison, but even he seemed to tremble as he spoke them. Her eyes did not rise. She didn't even pause her stitching. The needle kept moving in steady rhythm, in and out, pulling thread through torn fabric, mending what others would discard. And in that moment, the whisper of her scars grew louder than his voice. He stopped. He swayed, blinked, and for a second, his drunken courage faltered. He cursed and stumbled away, but the damage was done, not to her, but to us. We had all heard it. Her silence had shouted louder than his insult. Her scars had spoken, and the room obeyed. That night I lay awake again, listening to the soft sounds of her stitching. It was then I understood. Her scars were not reminders of what she had lost. They were reminders of what she refused to surrender. Her body had been broken, her life rewritten by violence, but her silence, her patience, her steady rhythm of survival belonged only to her. The Marines thought they were mocking her, but in truth, every laugh, every insult, every cruel whisper only revealed their fear. Because deep down, they knew. Her scars whispered of a strength none of them possessed. And I began to wonder if one day those whispers would become commands. The woman who refused to cry at night. The nights were the cruelest part of barracks life. The days, for all their drills and shouts, for all the noise of boots against concrete and orders barked until our ears rang, at least kept the mind occupied. But nights were different. Nights stretched long, filled with the silence of men pretending to sleep while their demons whispered louder than dreams. I had grown used to it. The coughing, the restless turning of bodies on creaking bunks, the muffled sobs of soldiers who thought no one was listening. War had stripped away illusions, but pride had a way of hiding tears in the dark. We all knew it. We all heard it. No one spoke of it in the morning, except her, or rather, except for the absence of her voice. The woman who carried her scars into our world never cried at night, and it was that silence, more than her scars, more than the laughter she endured, that began to unsettle the barracks. For 3 nights I lay awake listening. The men mocked her during the day, but at night they turned into children, vulnerable and broken, whispering names of wives they left behind, sons they might never see again, prayers they weren't sure God would hear. She heard it all, every sob, every plea, every curse spat into a pillow. And yet, from her corner, not a sound, not one tear. The absence gnawed at me. I wanted to believe she was strong beyond our comprehension, that her silence was unshakable because her battles had already been fought and won. But another part of me wondered, what kind of life does it take to burn the tears out of a person? The 4th night, I could no longer keep my curiosity buried. The barracks had quieted after another day of cruel whispers and mocking laughter. The kind of day that left me sick with shame I didn't show. Most men had finally surrendered to shallow sleep, their breathing uneven, dreams restless. She sat upright, sewing again. The glow of a small lamp lit her hands as the needle moved with steady rhythm. I rose from my bunk, drawn as though by some force I couldn't resist, and walked quietly to her. She didn't look up. "Don't you ever cry?" I whispered. Her hand paused just for a second. Then she pulled the thread tight and the sound was sharp, decisive. She didn't answer. "I hear them," I continued, "all of them, every night. And I know you hear them too. But you never make a sound." She set the needle down slowly and finally looked at me. Her eyes in that dim light were not hard, not cold, they were weary. Weary in a way that told me tears had long ago been emptied, drained like a river dried by too many summers of drought. Her lips parted, as if she might speak, but instead she shook her head. Just once. Then she picked up the needle again. That was her answer. It wasn't that she refused to cry. It was that the world had taken the privilege from her. Tears are for those who still hope to be comforted. She knew better. The next morning, the men tried again. One Marine, louder than the rest, shouted across the yard, "Maybe she doesn't cry because she's not human anymore. Maybe the scars burned it out of her." The others laughed, their voices like hammers pounding nails into coffins. She didn't respond. She carried crates, her arms strong, her face calm. And I realized then the laughter was not an insult. It was a shield. They mocked her because they feared her. By the 7th night, I could no longer resist. I asked her again when the barracks was quiet, "Why won't you cry?" She didn't stop sewing this time. She didn't even look up. She only spoke 2 words, the first I'd ever heard from her. "No one listens." Her voice was low, rough, like gravel beneath boots. Not soft, not broken, just factual, like an order. And in those 2 words, the entire truth of her existence was laid bare. No one listened, not when the scars were made, not when the laughter burned worse than fire, not when she sat alone, stitching cloth that could never cover the wounds of memory. No one listened, except me. And from that night forward, the barracks shifted again. The men still laughed, but less often. Their cruelty rang hollow in the face of her silence. Because now I knew what they did not. Every night she refused to cry was not weakness but defiance. Every dry eye was a declaration that she had survived enough tears for 100 lifetimes. And in her silence, I began to hear something else. Not absence, not emptiness, a command. The woman who refused to cry at night was not broken. She was teaching us all that tears had no power here, not in this place, not in this war. She carried scars the way others carried rifles, visible, undeniable, and lethal in their own way. And though the men still mocked, I saw the truth. One day, those scars would silence them all. The woman rumored in the mess hall. The mess hall was the heart of the barracks, but it was also its theater. Everything that was unsaid in the daylight found a way to surface between tin trays and the smell of watered soup. Men always needed stories to feed on when food was scarce or bland and when courage felt thin. It was easier to invent tales about others than to sit in silence and hear the truth of their own thoughts. By the 5th day, she had become the story. She sat always in the same place near the back of the hall beneath a dim light where shadows softened her scars but never erased them. She never rushed through her meal, and she never looked at those who whispered. That silence of hers gave room for rumors to grow like weeds. They began quietly in corners, when spoons clattered too loud for her to hear, but I knew she heard them anyway. Some said she had been captured behind enemy lines and tortured until nothing remained of the person she once was. Others said the scars were punishment from her own side, that she had crossed a line no one dared speak of. A few insisted she had been caught in a fire saving children from a burning village, and that she refused to tell the story because no one had thanked her. None of them knew the truth, and yet each rumor was told as if it carried certainty. Rumors are a dangerous kind of hunger. They feed on what is missing, and they grow until they begin to shape how men act. At first, the rumors were only entertainment in the mess hall. Men leaned closer to one another, grinning as if they had found treasure in their invented words. But soon the rumors became weapons. Laughter carried sharper edges when it was fueled by stories of disgrace or betrayal. Men mocked her not only for the scars they saw, but for the stories they imagined behind them. I listened but said nothing. I hated myself for that silence. I told myself that speaking would make no difference, that my voice was too small to drown out a chorus of cruelty. But in truth I stayed silent because I feared the weight of knowing the real story. It is easier to live among lies than to face a truth that demands something of you. She never broke. Every rumor thrown at her seemed to dissolve against her silence. She chewed her bread slowly, she sipped her soup steadily, and her eyes never lifted to challenge or defend. The more they invented, the stronger her silence became. It was as if she had built walls inside herself higher than any fortress, and the rumors could not climb them. One night, I dreamed of her scars whispering again, but this time they spoke in voices not of pain but of patience. They told me that every rumor was only smoke and that silence was fire. You cannot choke silence with smoke. In the dream, she looked at me, and though her lips did not move, I heard the words "no one listens," and I woke with the taste of ash in my mouth. The next day, the mess hall buzzed with a new rumor. They said the general himself had once known her, that he had seen her long before the scars, and that was why he froze when he entered the hall and met her gaze. The men laughed louder than ever, feeding on the scandal they imagined, but their laughter was nervous. They were testing the edges of a story too close to danger. To suggest that the general had history with her was to walk on a minefield. Still, they laughed because laughter is easier than fear. She sat in her usual place. The rumor must have reached her ears, but she gave no sign. She broke her bread in half and ate it slowly, her hands steady, her back straight. I realized then that she had mastered something none of us had. She had mastered the art of existing without explanation. Most of us spend our lives explaining ourselves, trying to justify our scars, our failures, our fears. But she gave nothing. She did not gift them with answers. She did not beg them for understanding. She let them choke on their own questions. And in that absence she held more power than the men who shouted. That night I sat near her again. I did not speak. I only listened to the scrape of her spoon against the metal tray and the slow rhythm of her breathing. Around us, whispers rose and fell, but they no longer pierced me the way they once did. They sounded like insects buzzing against stone. She was the stone. I thought of my own scars, then the ones no one could see. I thought of the choices I had buried in silence, of the faces that haunted me when the lights went out. I realized that the rumors the men spread about her were nothing but mirrors of their own hidden wounds. They needed her scars to carry their fear because they were too weak to face their own. By the 10th day, the mess hall was quieter. The rumors had not stopped, but they had changed. They carried less laughter and more unease. Some men lowered their voices when she passed. Others stopped speaking altogether until she was gone. Something in her silence had begun to weigh on them. They were learning what I already knew. The truth of her scars was stronger than any lie they could invent. She never cried at night. She never answered the whispers. She never explained. She lived in a silence that commanded more than words ever could. And in that silence, the mess hall became a place of reckoning, because every rumor that rose against her collapsed under the same truth. She was still there, still walking, still eating, still stitching, still breathing. And every day she endured. Without breaking, the men were forced to face the thing they feared most. That strength could exist in silence. That scars could be louder than laughter. That a woman they mocked was in fact the one who had already survived the battles they could not even name. And I wondered again how long it would take for them to understand that silence once ignored would soon command them all. That moment cracked something open in the barracks. The men who had laughed felt the laughter turn sour in their mouths. The rumors they had repeated suddenly seemed childish and dangerous. If the general himself froze before her, then who were they to mock? If her scars could silence him, then what power did they truly carry? For the first time since she had arrived, the balance of power shifted. No one said it aloud, but we all felt it. She was no longer the woman mocked at night or whispered about over soup. She was the woman who had stopped the general in his tracks, the woman he could not ignore. The following days were quieter. The mess hall no longer buzzed with rumors, but with questions men kept locked behind clenched jaws. Some avoided her eyes now, as though afraid of what they might reveal. Others stole glances at her scars with something that looked less like cruelty and more like unease. The laughter had dried up. What replaced it was harder to name. Respect, perhaps, or fear. I thought often about the way her gaze held steady when she looked at him. It was not defiance. It was not anger. It was recognition. Recognition of something none of us could see. Recognition of a history written on her skin and buried in his memory. That was why he froze. That was why he could not look away. At night, I imagined what story bound them together. Was she a survivor of an operation he had led? Was she a victim of choices he had signed from the safety of a command tent? Or was it something deeper, more personal, something that lived in the space between soldier and civilian, between orders given and lives broken? I would never know. But I knew this. He remembered her, and because he remembered her, we all began to. She remained unchanged. She still stitched her fabric at night. She still ate slowly, methodically. She still carried her silence like armor. But now that silence had weight, it pressed on us every time we entered the hall. It pressed on the general too, though he never returned at mealtime again. The woman who refused to cry at night had become the woman the general could not ignore. And in that truth, something powerful was born. Her scars were no longer objects of laughter. They were maps we could not read, but that we could no longer deny. They whispered louder than any rumor, and they commanded silence, even from the highest authority among us. I began to see her differently after that day, not just as a survivor, not just as a bearer of scars, but as a reminder. She reminded us all that war does not end with victory or surrender. It ends when the silence it leaves behind forces even generals to stop and face what they created. And she carried that silence with a strength no medals could honor. The woman whose scars froze his eyes. The image of that moment would not leave me. The general frozen at the threshold, her scars lit by the dull lamps of the mess hall, and the silence stretching long enough for every man in the room to feel the weight of something unseen. We carried it with us into the yard, into drills, into our bunks at night. It was like a ghost that walked beside us, reminding us that no rank, no medal, no uniform could erase the power of memory carved into flesh. Men who once laughed now bit their tongues. They lowered their voices when they passed her, afraid of being caught by eyes that did not belong to her. But to the general who could not look away, authority had been shaken in that single glance, and though no one dared to admit it, we all felt it. I began to notice the change in small ways. Where once the Marines had mocked her scars loudly, now they only whispered half-heartedly, and even that died quickly in their throats. They stole glances at her, but those glances no longer carried cruelty. They carried questions, the kind of questions no one wanted to voice. What had she survived that could freeze a general's eyes? What story was buried in those scars that could silence the highest voice in the room? The scars themselves seemed to grow heavier in our sight. They had always been there, burned into her neck, carved into her cheek, winding along her arms, but now they were not just marks of survival, they were evidence. Evidence of a truth that someone powerful wanted to forget, and because he wanted to forget, we could not stop remembering. At night I lay in my bunk staring at the ceiling while the barracks creaked with restless sleep. I thought of her silence, her refusal to cry, her patience in the face of cruelty. I thought of the general's stare, locked on her as though seeing a ghost. And I wondered if he saw not just her scars, but his own reflected back at him. Scars of choices made behind maps and orders, scars of signatures that condemned others to pain. The 8th night after that encounter, I rose quietly and walked to her corner. She was sewing again, always sewing, as if repairing cloth could undo the tears of the world. The small lamp lit her face, and the lines of her scars cast shadows that danced on the wall. I sat near her, not speaking. Her needle moved, steady and sure, and the silence between us was deeper than any conversation. In that silence, I understood something that no one else dared to see. Her scars did not belong to the past alone. They were alive. They spoke not of what had been done, but of what still remained undone. They carried stories unfinished, debts unpaid, justice unseen. That was why the general froze. He did not see a woman ruined. He saw a chapter of history that refused to stay closed. When she finally lifted her eyes from her stitching, they met mine, and for a fleeting moment I felt the same paralysis that had struck him. It was not fear of her, It was fear of myself, of what her silence forced me to remember. The faces of women we had passed on campaigns, the voices that begged behind locked doors, the smoke that rose from villages no one was supposed to talk about. I had buried them deep, but her scars unearthed them with a single glance. The next day, the men moved differently around her. They left her space in the yard. They avoided her table in the mess hall. Some of them stared with a kind of reverence, others with unease, but none with laughter. The barracks had learned what the general had taught us in his silence. Her scars commanded something more powerful than orders. They commanded memory. I began to see her as a mirror. She reflected back to each of us the things we wanted to hide. For the cruel, she reflected cruelty. For the weak, she reflected fear. For the guilty, she reflected judgment. And for the general, she reflected something so undeniable that his eyes froze in place. The rumors did not stop entirely. Men are weak creatures when faced with silence. They filled the emptiness with stories, softer now, more hesitant but still clinging to explanations. Some whispered that she was a survivor of a massacre covered up by command. Others said she had once been inside the general's own household, a servant or perhaps even family, and that her scars were the result of betrayal too deep to name. I did not believe any of them. I believed only what I saw, and what I saw was enough. Each night I grew more restless, haunted not by her silence but by my own. I had stayed quiet while she was mocked. I had stayed quiet while rumors spread. I had stayed quiet when the general froze, and I wondered if my silence was any different from hers. Hers was strength, a shield, a blade. Mine was cowardice. But then one night, as I listened again to the rhythm of her sewing, I realized something. Perhaps my silence was changing. Perhaps it was no longer cowardice, but listening. She had said it once, in that rough gravel voice that cut me open. No one listens. Maybe my silence could become something else. Maybe it could become the beginning of hearing what her scars whispered, what his eyes had remembered, what none of us dared to face. The woman whose scars froze his eyes did not need us to speak for her. She needed us to remember. And that was the command she gave without words. The woman who carried history in her flesh. The scars had already silenced the barracks and frozen the eyes of the general, but for me they became something even greater. They became history itself, written not on paper or in reports, but in skin. Her flesh was a record more honest than any archive, a chronicle of battles no one dared acknowledge, of crimes buried beneath medals and parades. To look at her was to look at the part of war the world always tried to erase. Men carried scars too, but we rarely spoke of them. A bullet graze across an arm became a story to boast about. A missing finger turned into a badge of survival. Shrapnel lodged near the spine was retold as proof of endurance. Our scars were used as decoration, sharpened into symbols of masculinity and courage. Hers were different. They were not worn like medals, but carried like chains that no one else could see. And because they could not fit into the story the army liked to tell about itself, the men mocked them, then feared them, and finally fell silent before them. I began to study them when she passed, not in cruelty but in reverence, a line across her cheek that bent like a river carved by fire, burns across her neck shaped like ropes pulled too tight, thin marks along her arms that looked less like accidents of battle and more like the deliberate handwriting of cruelty. They were not random, they were not meaningless. They were sentences written into her body by hands that had believed she would never stand again. Yet she stood. At night I imagined what each scar carried, not just pain but testimony. One scar spoke of nights locked in darkness, another of flames that consumed more than walls, another of blows struck not to kill, but to brand. They were memories that could not be erased, evidence that could not be dismissed. History had been carved into her flesh with the expectation that no one would ever listen. But now, in her silence, we listened. Even those who denied it listened. The general listened most of all, though he never returned to the mess hall when she was present. His absence was louder than any order he could have given. We all noticed. A man like him did not change his habits without reason. The fact that he avoided her spoke louder than his voice ever had. It told us that he remembered, and because he remembered, we began to. I started to think of her not as a woman alone in the barracks, but as a living archive. Every mark she carried was a document signed not in ink, but in blood. And unlike the reports filed in dusty cabinets, unlike the speeches made to justify operations, her body could not lie. It told the truth simply by existing. And that truth unsettled us more than bullets ever had. In the yard during drills, I watched men stumble when she passed near them. Their steps faltered, their eyes dropped, their shoulders tensed. They felt the weight of history pressing against them. Not the history in textbooks, but the kind of history soldiers bury in silence, the kind that rots inside when ignored. She carried it openly, and that was why they could not look at her for long. I asked myself often what gave her the strength to bear it. Was it defiance? Was it resignation? Or was it something deeper, something we could not name? To carry history in flesh is to carry the shame of others as well as your own. Every man who mocked her had left another scar unseen. Every rumor whispered at the mess hall was another mark etched into her story. And yet she endured, walking each day with steps that told us none of it could erase her presence. One night, as I watched her sew in the corner again, I realized something important. Her sewing was not only about mending fabric, it was ritual. It was the act of stitching together pieces of herself the world had tried to tear apart. Every pull of the needle was a declaration that what had been broken would still hold. Every patch was proof that what had been destroyed could be remade. She stitched cloth, but she was really stitching history back into meaning. I envied her silence. My own memories of war screamed inside me, demanding words I could never speak. Faces of villagers left behind, cries of women dragged away, children whose eyes I could not forget. I buried them in silence, but my silence was suffocation. Hers was not. Hers was breath. Hers was survival. She taught me that silence could carry not only pain, but power. The barracks grew quieter in those days. Men spoke less, laughed less, even fought less. They pretended it was fatigue from long drills. But I knew the truth. She had entered our world like a ghost, and now she had become its law. None of us dared break the silence she commanded. None of us dared challenge the history her flesh carried, because in her presence we were reminded that we too were part of that history, whether we admitted it or not. I sometimes wondered if she hated us all, if she looked at us and saw not comrades but accomplices. For in war, there are no innocent witnesses. We had all turned our heads at some point. We had all walked past doors we should have opened. We had all heard cries we pretended were the wind. Perhaps she knew. Perhaps her silence was not only defiance, but condemnation. And yet she did not treat us with hatred. She treated us with nothing at all, and that nothing was heavier than any weapon. When I closed my eyes, I saw her scars as maps, maps of places erased from records, of nights erased from memory, of truths erased from speeches. They led not to victory or glory, but to silence. They reminded me that the true history of war is not written by generals, but by those who survive with bodies torn into testimony. And she was the clearest record I had ever seen. The woman who carried history in her flesh walked among us every day. She ate in silence, she stitched in silence, she slept in silence. Yet her presence was louder than the rifles stacked at our doors, louder than the orders shouted across the yard, louder even than the laughter that once tried to bury her. She did not need words, she did not need rank, she did not need to prove anything. Her scars were enough. They were her past, and they were our judgment. They were history itself, carved into skin, and no general could erase them. The woman who turned laughter into silence, The barracks had once been a place of endless noise. Men laughed to mask their fear, shouted to prove their strength, cursed to remind themselves they were still alive. Every corner carried echoes of bravado, and every night was filled with whispers that pretended to be courage. But when she arrived, the rhythm began to change. The laughter that once rolled through the mess hall like thunder now faltered, broke apart, and finally died. She had turned it into silence. It did not happen in a single day. At first the laughter was cruel and sharp, cutting at her scars as though each word could wound her more than blades already had. They mocked her with stories. They joked about her face. They pretended she was less than human because the truth of her survival frightened them. But every time they laughed, she did nothing. She ate slowly, she stitched patiently, she walked calmly. She gave them nothing to feed on, and little by little their laughter began to sound hollow even to their own ears. I remember the last time a Marine tried to laugh at her out loud. It was in the yard after drills when the men were tired and restless. He pointed at her scars and said something cruel, something meant to draw the others into chorus. But the chorus never came. His laugh echoed alone, it bouncing off the walls of the barracks like a sound out of place. He looked around, waiting for others to join him, but no one did. They avoided his eyes. They shifted uneasily. They remained silent. And so, he stopped laughing. From that day forward, no one dared again. The silence that replaced the laughter was heavier than the noise had ever been. Laughter could be dismissed, shrugged off as boys being boys, soldiers being crude. But silence was different. Silence forced the men to face themselves. Silence revealed that their cruelty had never touched her, but had instead exposed their own weakness. And once they realized it, the power of laughter was broken forever. She walked through the barracks the same as always. She carried no weapon, wore no rank, demanded nothing. Yet wherever she moved, the air changed. Men stood aside, not out of respect for orders, but out of something deeper. They could no longer laugh in her presence, because laughter belonged to the world before they saw her scars freeze the General's eyes. After that, every chuckle felt like a betrayal of something they could not name. At night, I lay awake listening to the absence of sound. The barracks had once been restless with jokes and whispers in the dark, but now even that was fading. Men lay in silence, their thoughts too loud to share. It was then I realized the truth. She had not silenced them by force. She had silenced them by reflection. She had shown them what their laughter truly was. It was cowardice disguised as humor. It was fear dressed in mockery. It was weakness pretending to be strength. And once revealed, it could not continue. I thought of the nights before she came, when laughter had been my only shield against memory. How I too had joined the chorus, forcing laughter through clenched teeth to hide the screams I remembered from villages left behind. I thought of how easy it had been to laugh at others, so I would not have to hear the voices of the dead. But when she arrived with her silence and her scars, the shield broke. My laughter turned to ash in my mouth. I could not mock her because she was not weakness. She was truth. Some of the men grew restless in the new silence. They fidgeted during meals, glanced at one another with nervous eyes, tried to spark conversation but failed. Others seemed relieved. They ate in peace, drilled in peace, even slept more soundly. It was as if her silence had divided us into two kinds of men, those who feared it and those who needed it. The general did not return. His absence became part of the silence too. Every time we entered the mess hall, we remembered the way his eyes froze and his hand trembled. That memory was enough to silence any man who thought of laughing. If a general could be silenced by her presence, then so could we. I began to wonder if she knew what she had done. Did she understand that she had reshaped the air around us? Did she know that her scars had become stronger than orders, stronger than fear, stronger than the discipline drilled into us? Perhaps she did. Or perhaps she had lived in silence so long that she no longer cared. But I cared. I cared because I could feel myself changing. Her silence seeped into me like water into dry ground. I found myself speaking less, listening more. I found myself staring at my own hands, at the small scars I carried, at the memories they represented. And I realized I too had tried to drown my pain in laughter. But now there was no laughter left, only silence. And in that silence the truth finally began to surface. The truth that war is not glory but wounds carved into bodies that never asked for them. The truth that survival is not triumph but burden. The truth that laughter is only another way of hiding from guilt. She taught us all of it without a single word. The woman who turned laughter into silence did not raise her voice, did not lift a weapon, did not demand recognition. She only existed, and in existing, she forced us to see. Her scars commanded more than silence. They commanded memory. They commanded us to confront what we had done and what we had ignored. And once you have seen the truth reflected in scars, you can never laugh again. The woman whose silence was louder than orders. Orders were the spine of the barracks. They structured our days, told us when to rise, when to eat, when to march, when to fire, when to rest. Orders filled the void that war left behind. A man without orders became a man with too much room for thought, and thought was dangerous in places where memory already haunted every corner. Orders kept us moving forward, even when we no longer knew why. Yet in the presence of the woman with scars, orders began to sound weaker. Her silence was louder than all of them. It happened in small ways first. A command to stand at attention would be barked across the yard, and men would snap upright with rigid spines. But then she would walk by, calm and deliberate, not rushing, not bending to the rhythm. The sound of her boots against the ground was softer than the command, yet more powerful. Men's eyes drifted from the officer shouting to her slow steps, and the officer's voice seemed to crack in the air. During drills, another officer shouted for us to run, faster, harder, longer. Men gritted their teeth and pushed, the sound of boots pounding in unison like thunder. Yet when she passed at the edge of the yard, walking slowly with her stitched bundle in hand, the rhythm of the run faltered. We noticed her calm steps more than his angry voice. Some stumbled, some slowed, not out of defiance but out of distraction. Her silence had become a second command that lived beneath the official ones, and it carried more weight. In the mess hall, the same happened. Orders to sit, to line up, to clear out quickly were given daily. Men obeyed, moving in clumsy rhythm to authority. But whenever she remained seated after the order to rise, no one dared rush her. They moved slower, waiting, uneasy, until she finally stood and walked away. Her scars set the tempo more than the officer's whistle. I wondered if the officers noticed. They must have. They were not blind, but none dared to speak of it. Perhaps even they felt it, the way silence wrapped around her like a mantle stronger than rank. To confront her was to confront what her scars represented, and no officer wanted that responsibility. Orders kept the illusion of control intact. Her silence tore it apart. At night, I thought about the paradox of it. A woman with no weapon, no title, no authority, commanding more obedience than the men who barked orders from dawn to dusk. How was it possible? The answer was clear. Orders were external. They struck from outside, forcing men into line whether they believed in them or not. Her silence was internal. It lived inside us once we felt it. It did not push. It pulled. It did not demand. It reminded. And in that reminder, it carried us further than orders ever could. I began to notice changes in myself. When officers shouted, my ears barely heard them. My eyes followed her instead. When orders came, I obeyed, but I obeyed mechanically, not with conviction. My conviction had shifted. It belonged to the truth her scars carried, to the silence that told us more about war than any manual of strategy. The barracks was not the same. Conversations dried up. Laughter was gone, even arguments diminished. Men no longer tried to prove themselves with noise. They felt the futility of it. Against her silence, every word seemed empty. Against her scars, every boast seemed small. Even the cruelest among us had fallen quiet, not from respect, but from recognition that they could not overpower what she carried. The general remained absent. His silence outside the mess hall echoed our silence within it. It was as though she had infected the entire chain of command. His orders reached us still, but they arrived diluted, distant, hollow. We remembered his frozen stare, his trembling hand, his inability to speak when faced with her, and that memory stripped power from every command that followed. If he could not face her, why should we face anything the same way again? I began to believe her presence was no accident. Perhaps she had been placed here not as punishment or exile, but as a reminder. Perhaps someone had thought we needed to see what war truly was, beyond drills and victories. Or perhaps it was not planned at all. Perhaps it was fate, the kind of cruel fate that places truth in the middle of those least able to bear it. Whatever the reason, her silence had become the true law of the barracks. One evening, an officer shouted for lights out. Men turned, ready to obey, but she remained seated under her small lamp stitching as always. No one dared move. The officer's voice cracked with irritation. He shouted again. Still no one moved. We waited. Finally, when she finished her thread and tied the knot, she placed the needle down, blew out her lamp, and lay down. Only then did the barracks follow. The officer stood helpless, realizing his authority had been measured against her silence and found smaller. He left without another word. That moment changed everything. From then on, the timing of the barracks followed her more than the whistle. We rose when she rose. We slept when she rested. We ate when she moved to the line. Without knowing it, we had all become soldiers under her command. She never asked for it. She never wanted it. But authority in war is not always taken by those who demand. Sometimes it is given to those who endure. Her silence had become our compass, her scars our law, her presence our truth. And I realized one night as I watched her sew that orders are fragile things. They crumble under the weight of hypocrisy. They collapse when men no longer believe. But silence born of suffering, silence carved into flesh, silence carried like a shield that cannot be broken. It does not need obedience. It already owns it. The woman whose silence was louder than orders had already won the only battle that mattered. The woman no one dared to name. By then, she had become more than a presence in the barracks. She was an unspoken law, a constant weight that pressed on every man who crossed her path. Yet strangely, no one ever spoke her name. Perhaps some of the officers knew it, perhaps the general remembered it, but among us, she was never called anything more than her. It was not forgetfulness, it was fear. To name her was to make her human, and none of us were prepared to face that truth. So she remained nameless, a figure of scars and silence that moved through our days like a shadow made of flesh. The barracks had names for everyone. Nicknames born of habits, of mistakes, of wounds carried from battles. Some were cruel, some affectionate, some merely practical, but none were left nameless, except her. She was beyond nicknames, beyond titles, beyond the reach of words. Every man knew that to speak her name aloud would shatter something fragile we were all clinging to. Because if we named her, we would have to admit she was one of us. And to admit that meant admitting that what had been done to her could be done to any of us. I listened sometimes to the whispers late at night. Men spoke in fragments, never daring to finish sentences. The woman, her scars, the general. They circled around her story, but never entered it fully. It was as if her silence infected their tongues, forcing them to swallow every word before it was born. They feared naming her more than they feared death. I too avoided it. Even in my own thoughts, I hesitated to imagine her name. It felt like trespassing into a sacred place. I wondered if she carried that namelessness as another scar, another theft of identity, or if she embraced it as a shield. Without a name, she could not be reduced to rumor or ridicule. Without a name, she became larger than herself, a symbol too vast for laughter to contain. During drills, the officers barked names with sharp tones. Every man responded with a shout, a confirmation of existence. But when she passed, they never spoke her name. They ordered her with gestures instead, vague commands that did not fit into language. She obeyed when she chose, but never because of words. Even officers feared saying her name, as though to call it would summon the silence that had already defeated them. In the mess hall it was worse. Conversations bent and broke to avoid her. No one dared say pass this to her, or sit next to her, or ask her for anything. They pretended she was invisible, but the act of pretending revealed more than it concealed. She was not invisible. She was the center of the room, the axis around which silence spun. Her namelessness became the proof of her power. One afternoon, a new recruit asked carelessly who she was. He had not yet learned the rules of the barracks. The question dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Conversation stopped. Forks froze halfway to mouths. The air tightened. No one answered him. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke. The recruit shifted uncomfortably, realizing his mistake, and never asked again. That was how the rule remained intact. She was not to be named. I thought often about the cruelty of it. A person stripped not only of voice but of identity. A body carrying history and scars, but denied even the dignity of being called by name. And yet, as days passed, I began to understand something deeper. Perhaps it was not cruelty at all. Perhaps it was reverence. Names make things small. Names tie people down to syllables that can be bent and twisted by others. She had moved beyond that. By refusing her a name, even unconsciously, we had given her something else. We had given her permanence. She became not an individual, but a symbol. Not just a survivor, but survival itself. Not just a victim, but testimony itself. Her silence was not one person's silence. It was the silence of every village erased from maps, every cry unheard in the night, every wound carved into flesh and forgotten by history. She carried all of it, and to name her would have been to reduce that weight into something too small for truth. Still, I longed to know, to hear her name once spoken aloud, to anchor her in the world of the living instead of leaving her adrift in the realm of shadows. But I never asked. I never dared, because part of me knew that if I learned her name, I would never be able to forget it. And to never forget, it would mean to carry her scars with me for the rest of my life. The woman no one dared to name walked through the barracks each day with calm steps. Her silence grew heavier with time, and though she was nameless to us, she was unforgettable. We did not need a name to remember her. We needed only to close our eyes and see the scars, to hear the silence, to feel the way laughter died in her presence. And so she remained nameless. And in that namelessness, she became eternal. The woman who haunted the general, memories. The general did not return to the mess hall after the day his eyes froze on her. His absence spoke louder than his presence ever had. Yet his shadow remained. Every order we received carried the weight of that moment. Every command reminded us that even he, the man whose voice had bent entire battalions, had once been silenced by the sight of her scars. The barracks never forgot. We never could. But I knew that he had not escaped her. He could avoid the mess hall, he could avoid her presence, but he could not avoid his memory. She haunted him. I saw it in the way his reports grew shorter, in the way his temper flared without reason, in the way he avoided the gaze of his own men as though every face might remind him of hers. He had been marked by her as surely as she had been marked by fire and blade. Men whispered about it in fragments. They said the general had recognized her from a past campaign, that he had once ordered an operation in which a village was burned, and she had been left behind to suffer what came after. Others claimed she had been in a camp under his command, that her scars were the result of his silence when crimes were committed. No one knew the truth, but all agreed on one thing: he remembered her. I imagined his nights long and restless, haunted by the memory of her face. I imagined him sitting at his desk, pen in hand, unable to sign orders without seeing the line of scars carved across her cheek. I imagined him trying to eat while remembering the way she ate slowly, deliberately, never bending to the noise around her. She had become his ghost, following him in every silence, in every shadow. The strange thing was that she never sought him out. She never looked for him, never demanded confrontation, never spoke his name. She did not need to. Her silence was enough. He carried her with him whether he wished to or not. She had become the wound he could not treat, the scar he could not cover, and the more he tried to escape, the deeper it cut. For us in the barracks, the effect was profound. To see a general undone by memory was to see authority stripped bare. It forced us to reckon with truths we had buried. If even he could not escape the weight of what had been done, what chance did we have? Her scars became mirrors, reflecting not only his guilt but ours. Every man who had turned away from cries in the night, every soldier who had obeyed orders to look forward and never back, saw in her the faces of those we had abandoned. She haunted us all, but him most of all. I began to wonder if that was her true power. Not that she had survived when others would have perished, not that she had silenced the laughter or shattered the illusion of strength, but that she forced memory onto those who wanted to forget. She carried history in her flesh and made it impossible for others to erase their part in it. One evening during inspection, I caught sight of the general standing at the edge of the yard. His eyes swept the line of soldiers, cold and calculating as always, but when she passed at the far end, his gaze faltered. It was quick, almost invisible, but I saw it. The tremor of a man caught between past and present. He recovered his posture instantly, but the truth had already slipped through. She haunted him even in daylight. That night I imagined his dreams. Did he see her walking through the ruins of places he had ordered destroyed? Did he hear her silence louder than the roar of flames? Did he wake in sweat, trembling not from fear of the enemy, but from the scars of a woman who refused to cry? I will never know, but I am certain he did. For no man can carry memory that heavy and escape unscathed. The woman who haunted the general's memories never spoke of him. She never acknowledged his absence, never sought his eyes again. But her very existence was enough, and that was the cruelty of truth. She did not have to accuse him. His own memory was the accusation. She did not have to raise her voice. His silence became her echo. She had become the ghost he could not exorcise, the living reminder that history carved into flesh cannot be buried by rank or power. And in that haunting, we learned something about ourselves. We learned that war never ends when guns fall silent. It ends when memory forces even the most powerful to tremble. It ends when silence breaks orders, when scars command attention, when truth walks unarmed through barracks and still bends men to its will. The woman who haunted the general's memories had already won. She had turned his authority into ash, his voice into silence, his past into judgment. And though he tried to hide it, every man under his command saw the truth. His power had shifted. It no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the silence he could not escape. And so she remained, nameless among us, scarred yet unbroken, the ghost that haunted not only him but all of us. The woman who taught the barracks fear. Fear had always lived among us. It crept through the cracks of our discipline. It clung to our boots when we marched. It lingered in our dreams when we pretended to sleep. Yet fear had always been something we disguised. We covered it with laughter, with shouting, with boasts of courage that evaporated the moment mortars fell. We had learned to live with fear by pretending it was not there. But she arrived and taught us something new. She taught us to fear without disguise. It was not the kind of fear born of bullets or bombs. That fear we knew well and had learned to endure. It was a deeper fear, the fear of being seen. Her scars saw us. They stripped away the armor we wore inside our minds. Every glance at her reminded us of what we had done, of what we had ignored, of what we had chosen not to remember. She carried the history we wanted buried, and that was the kind of truth no man could laugh away. At first the men resisted. They mocked her, as if cruelty could drown the unease she stirred. But when laughter died and silence took its place, fear crept in. The barracks changed. The mess hall no longer echoed with noise. Conversations became cautious, measured, careful not to brush against her presence. Men lowered their voices when she walked by, not out of respect, but out of fear that she might hear the trembling hidden inside their words. Fear showed itself in strange ways. Some avoided her completely, walking long paths across the yard just to escape her shadow. Others stared too long, as if hoping that by memorizing her scars, they could learn to own their fear. A few turned inward, speaking less, drifting away from the group, unable to bear the weight of what she reflected back at them. The barracks had been a cage before, but now it was a mirror, and every man feared what he saw in it. One night, a soldier woke screaming from a nightmare. He'd seen her face in the dark, scars glowing like embers, eyes unblinking. He shouted her into existence, and for a moment we all froze, waiting for her to rise, to react, to break the silence. She did not. She remained on her cot, steady as always, her breath calm, her eyes closed. The soldier trembled, whispering apologies into the air, though she never demanded them. That was the power of her fear. She did not need to punish. We punished ourselves. Even the officers felt it. Their orders grew sharper, louder, but less effective. We obeyed, but our eyes strayed to her. Their authority cracked in the presence of scars that commanded more than rank. They feared her too, though they would never admit it. Their voices shook when they passed her. Their glances betrayed memories they tried to bury. She was not just our silence, she was theirs as well. I began to see fear differently. It was no longer the enemy we had to crush. It was the teacher we could not ignore. Through her silence we learned that fear was not weakness. Fear was truth. Fear was the acknowledgement of what had been done, of what could never be undone. She carried it without trembling, and by doing so she forced us to feel our own. I remembered the first days when I had stayed silent, watching her mocked and ridiculed. I had thought myself a coward then, but as weeks passed I understood something else. My silence had turned into listening, and listening had turned into fear. Not fear of her, but fear of myself. Fear of the memories I carried, the orders I had obeyed, the doors I had not opened. She taught me that the true battlefield was not outside these walls, but inside each of us. And on that battlefield, fear was the only honest weapon. The barracks became a place of shadows. Men avoided the corners where she sat sewing. They left their trays untouched when she entered the mess hall. They pretended not to watch her, but their eyes betrayed them. Even in silence, she dominated the air. We feared not her strength, but our own weakness in comparison. One afternoon, a storm broke over the yard, rain pounding on the tin roof, lightning splitting the sky. The men rushed inside, shouting to cover their unease, but she walked through the rain slowly, calmly, each drop sliding across her scars like reminders of fire long past. She entered the barracks soaked yet unbroken, and the silence that followed was more terrifying than thunder. She had taught us that fear did not roar, it whispered. From that day forward, no one doubted it. She was the teacher we had not chosen, the mirror we could not escape. She had turned our laughter into silence, our orders into echoes, our courage into questions. And above all, she had taught us fear. Fear of memory, fear of truth, fear of the part of war no medal would ever honor. The woman who taught the barracks fear did not need to speak. She only needed to exist. And in her existence, she revealed what none of us dared to admit, that the greatest enemy we faced was not out there beyond the gates. It was here, inside us, waiting in the silence she commanded. The woman who wore her scars as medals. Medals had always been the way the army measured sacrifice. They shone on uniforms, pinned to chests with pride. Each one a symbol of endurance, bravery, or loss made noble by ceremony. Men longed for them, fought for them, sometimes even died for them. But in truth, medals were polished lies, polished to hide the filth of what war really was. Her scars made those medals look like toys. She wore them not because she chose to, but because life and cruelty had carved them into her. And yet she carried them with a dignity no medal could ever grant. I began to see the difference more clearly each day. Men who once boasted about their medals now fell silent when she entered the hall. The silver and bronze on their uniforms gleamed under the dim lights, but none of it mattered in her presence. Her scars were darker, deeper, etched by pain no parade would ever honor. They were not pinned on by generals in ceremonies. They were burned in by fire, cut in by blades, left by hands that believed she would vanish under their weight. But she did not vanish. She stood, and in standing she transformed those scars into something greater than medals. At night, when I lay awake listening to her steady stitching, I thought of my own medals locked in a box under my bunk. I had polished them once with pride, believing they made me someone worth remembering. Now they felt heavy with emptiness. What had they really meant? That I had followed orders, that I had survived where others had not, that I had endured moments of fear and emerged alive. They were nothing compared to the endurance carved into her flesh. She had no box to hide hers in. She carried them always, visible to the world, undeniable. The men knew it too, though none admitted it. Their eyes betrayed envy mixed with shame. They had sought medals to prove themselves, but her scars proved something far beyond them. They proved survival not as triumph, but as resistance. They proved pain born without surrender. They proved truth that could not be hidden beneath ceremony. Every glance at her stripped their medals of meaning. I wondered often if she knew, if she realized she wore her scars as medals, if she recognized the way they silenced us more than any officer's command. Perhaps she did. Perhaps she did not care. For her, they were not symbols to be honored or displayed. They were simply her, the body she had been forced to carry, the history carved into her skin. Yet in our eyes they became medals none of us could match. One morning during inspection, an officer praised a soldier for his bravery and awarded him a ribbon. The barracks clapped dutifully, but the applause was hollow. She stood at the back, silent as always, and in that silence the ribbon looked like a scrap of cloth compared to the lines across her arms and neck. The soldier himself looked down, his pride shrinking as he caught sight of her. He knew the truth, we all did. His ribbon was decoration, her scars were reality. The officers avoided the comparison. They spoke of honor, of sacrifice, of courage, but they never addressed the weight she carried. They feared the truth her presence revealed. Medals could be handed out, bought with obedience and measured in victories. Her scars could not be given or taken away. They were beyond control, beyond ceremony, beyond their grasp. The general stayed away, but I sometimes imagined what he thought when he remembered her. Did he think of his chest, heavy with medals, shining before parades, while her body carried the medals of his decisions, scars that would never shine but would never fade? Did he know that her silent presence had stripped his honors of their meaning? Perhaps that was why he avoided her. Not because of shame alone, but because she had unmasked the emptiness of the symbols he had lived for. The barracks learned slowly that respect was no longer tied to the polished metal on our uniforms. It was tied to the endurance written into her flesh. She did not need parades. She did not need speeches. She did not need generals to pin anything on her chest. She had survived, and survival itself had become the highest medal. I thought about it often, and the more I did, the more I realized how fragile the world of men was. We built systems of honor, structures of recognition, ceremonies to pretend that pain had purpose, but she dismantled all of it simply by existing. Her scars told us the truth. Pain has no purpose, survival has no ceremony, and dignity comes not from what others give you, but from what they cannot take away. The woman who wore her scars as medals never asked for recognition, yet she received it in silence. She never marched in parades, yet we all followed her steps. She never lifted her voice, yet her scars shouted louder than drums. She never saluted, yet her presence was the highest honor among us. And so it became clear. Medals rust, fade, are lost or forgotten in drawers. Her scars would never fade, never rust, never vanish. They were eternal. And in their eternity, they reminded us that truth is not polished. Truth is carved, burned, cut deep, and carried until the end. The woman whose scars commanded silence. The end did not arrive with fanfare. There was no final battle in the yard, no confrontation in the mess hall, no officer standing tall to deliver a speech that tied together all that had happened. The end arrived quietly, as everything about her always had. She remained the same, moving through our days with calm steps, carrying her scars as though they weighed nothing, though we all knew they weighed more than any of us could endure. Yet something had changed, not in her, but in us. By then the barracks was unrecognizable compared to the place it had been when she first walked through its doors. The laughter was gone, stripped away piece by piece until the sound of it became a memory too fragile to hold. The boasts had died, the rumors had shriveled, even the officers' voices carried less authority. What remained was silence, and in that silence lived truth. She had commanded it without ever asking for it, without ever demanding. Her scars had spoken for her, louder than any voice could. I thought often about the way she had reshaped us. Men who once mocked her now avoided their own reflections. Men who once shouted now lowered their heads. Even those who still carried medals on their uniforms wore them with less pride, as if they had seen them exposed for what they were. And the general, though absent, remained trapped in her shadow, his silence proof that she had haunted him beyond repair. But it was not fear alone that she left us with. It was something heavier, something that pressed into the marrow of our bones. It was remembrance. Her scars were not only her story, they were the story of war itself, carved into a single body so that none of us could pretend not to know. They reminded us of what we had seen and chosen to forget. They reminded us of doors locked and cries ignored. They reminded us that survival is not triumph, that silence is not emptiness, that pain does not fade simply because history chooses to bury it. She never spoke more than those 3 words she had once given me: no one listens. That truth carried through every day she remained among us. And by the end, we listened. Perhaps too late, but we did. We listened not with ears, but with the stillness that filled every corner of the barracks. We listened with the silence that followed her footsteps, with the way we stopped eating when she entered, with the way we lowered our eyes when she passed. We listened in the only way we could. On the last night before she left, I stayed awake longer than usual. She sat in her corner, stitching as always, the lamplight falling across her face, highlighting the lines that time and cruelty had carved. I tried to memorize every detail. The steady motion of her hands, the calm rhythm of her breath, the unbroken strength in her eyes. I knew I would never see her again, and yet I also knew I would never forget her. None of us would. When she finally lay down, silence wrapped the barracks like a shroud. Not a single cough, not a single restless turn, not even the usual whispers that men could not contain. The night belonged to her. It was as though the world itself had bowed to the weight of her scars, acknowledging the truth they carried. We slept inside that silence, restless but reverent, knowing it was the last time we would share it. In the morning, she was gone. No announcement, no farewell. Her corner was empty, her needle and thread tucked neatly away, as if she had never been there at all. But the silence remained. It clung to the air, to our uniforms, to our thoughts. It had become part of us, inseparable from who we now were. She had commanded it, and even in her absence we could not escape it. The officers tried to restore order. They barked louder, demanded more, filled the yard with shouts meant to drown out memory, but it was useless. We obeyed their commands with our bodies, but our minds belonged to her. Their voices were hollow compared to the silence she had left behind. No order could undo what we had seen, what we had felt. No rank could erase the truth of scars carried with such dignity. In time, some men left, some died. Some continued to serve. Life moved on, as it always does. But none of us carried on the same. She had branded us as surely as her scars had been branded into her. We carried the silence forward, into every camp, every march, every night alone with memory. And that silence reminded us of her, of what she had survived, of what we had allowed, of what war truly was. I never learned her name. Perhaps that was for the best. A name would have made her smaller, would have tied her to one story when she carried so many. Instead, she remained nameless, eternal, larger than any of us, larger even than the general who could not face her. She was not one woman alone. She was every woman carved into history by violence, every survivor silenced by those who did not listen, every scar the world tried to ignore. The woman whose scars commanded silence had changed us all. She had turned laughter into ash, orders into echoes, medals into shame. She had stripped war of its illusions and revealed it for what it truly was. And though she left without a word, she remained with us forever. Because silence once commanded can never be undone. Years have passed since then, and still, when I close my eyes, I see her. Not her face, not even her scars, but the silence she carried. It fills me even now, heavier than any memory of battle, louder than any explosion, more enduring than any medal I ever received. It is the silence that commands me to remember, to never look away again, to never forget. And so I write these words not to honor her. She needed no honor from me, but to confess that we failed her, that we mocked her, that we allowed cruelty to echo unchecked. To confess that she carried more than any of us, and bore it with more dignity than we could ever hope to. To confess that she taught us fear, truth, and silence. She was the woman whose scars commanded silence. And even now, long after she is gone, that silence commands me still.